If he hadn't signed those papers, she would never have walked again. That was the sentence that followed him for the rest of his life. At the time, it didn't sound like a tragedy. It sounded like a responsibility. Like the kind of moment people talk about when they say, "You find out who you really are." He didn't hesitate, and that, more than anything else, was the beginning of the end. If you believe that love is proven through sacrifice, stay with this story until the end. Because this isn't about what he gave, it's about what that sacrifice created. The accident happened on an ordinary afternoon. No storm, no high-speed chase, no dramatic warning. Just a city intersection. A misjudged moment, and a sound that no one who heard it ever forgot. By the time he arrived at the hospital, she was already unconscious. Machines spoke for her. Monitors replaced words. Doctors spoke carefully, the way people do when certainty would be cruel. They didn't say she would never walk again. They said there was a window. A narrow one. There was a procedure. Complicated. Risky. Expensive. Then there was everything that followed it. Months of rehabilitation, physical therapy, specialized care. Without it, they explained, the damage would likely be permanent. With it, no promises. Just possibility. He stood there listening, nodding, absorbing information that felt strangely abstract. Numbers, percentages, timelines. What no one said out loud was the part that mattered most. None of it would be covered. Insurance stopped short of the experimental procedures. The rehabilitation program was private. The equipment alone cost more than most people made in a year. When the doctor paused, as if waiting for a question, he asked the only one that mattered. "How soon do we have to decide?" The answer came without hesitation. "Today." He looked at her through the glass. She was still. Pale, smaller than she had ever looked before. When she woke up later that night, she was groggy but aware. The pain hadn't fully arrived yet. Shock was still doing its work. He told her everything, not to pressure her, not to convince her, just to be honest. She listened quietly. When he finished, she didn't cry. She didn't panic. She looked at the ceiling for a long moment and then said something that would stay with him forever. "If it's too much," she said, her voice weak but steady, "don't do it. No tears, no pleading, just permission." He took her hand and promised her she wouldn't have to worry about anything. He believed that promise was love. The loans came fast, faster than the reality of them. Banks were willing to talk to someone with his background, his assets, his stability. They didn't flinch at the number. $2 million, structured, secured, clean. On paper, it made sense. He told himself this wasn't spending, it was investing. In her recovery, in their future, in a life that hadn't been broken yet. He signed documents he barely read. Initials, signatures, dates. Every stroke of the pen felt like progress, like movement. The surgery was successful. That word carried a lot of weight. It meant she survived. It meant the worst-case scenarios were avoided. It did not mean she would walk. Not yet. Recovery was slow, painful, humbling. He rearranged his entire life around her schedule. Appointments, therapy sessions, specialists. He learned how to lift her without hurting her, how to encourage without pushing, how to be present without making her feel weak. She never asked for more. That was the part everyone admired. Friends would say how strong she was, how brave, how lucky she was to have someone like him. He absorbed those comments quietly. He didn't feel heroic. He felt necessary. And necessity has a way of becoming identity. Months passed. She progressed faster than expected. Not miraculously, but steadily. There were days when she cried in frustration. Days when the pain made her silent. He was always there. Not because she demanded it, because he believed that was what love looked like. He handled the bills, the logistics, the debt. She focused on healing. When she took her first steps with support, the room felt electric. When she stood on her own for the first time, he cried. She smiled. She hugged him and whispered, "I couldn't have done this without you." He held on to that sentence like proof. By the time she could walk unassisted, the worst seemed behind them. The crisis phase was over. Life was supposed to begin again. But something subtle had shifted. She became quieter, more independent, not distant, just less anchored to him. She started staying longer at therapy, talking more about the future, a future that sounded lighter, cleaner, less burdened. He told himself this was healthy, that recovery included emotional freedom, that he shouldn't expect gratitude to look like devotion. Still, there were moments that didn't sit right. She never talked about the debt, never asked how he was managing it, never acknowledged the weight he was carrying now that she didn't have to. When he tried to joke about it, she smiled politely and changed the subject. She spoke often about moving forward, about not being defined by what happened, about leaving the accident in the past. He agreed, because who would argue with that? The hospital visits became routine, shorter, less intense. There was one doctor who had followed her case closely from the beginning. Professional, calm, confident. He explained things clearly, spoke to her, not around her. He seemed to represent something different, not sacrifice, not crisis, but normalcy, the future. The time, he didn't notice how often she mentioned him, how comfortable she seemed there, how little she talked about home afterward. He was too busy managing payments, refinancing timelines, the reality of what $2 million actually meant. He believed the hardest part was over, that once she could walk, everything would even out. He didn't understand yet that some sacrifices don't end when the crisis does. They linger, they change the balance of a relationship. And sometimes, they teach the other person something dangerous, that there will always be someone willing to pay. Recovery changes people. That was what everyone told him. Bodies heal at their own pace, they said. Minds follow later. So when she began to change, he didn't question it. He told himself this was progress. The first thing that returned was her confidence. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It showed up in posture. In the way she walked without looking down. In the way she stopped asking for help before standing up. At first, he felt proud. Then he felt unnecessary. She started insisting on going to appointments alone. "It's fine," she said. "You've already done so much." He smiled when she said that. He thought it was gratitude. He didn't realize it was distance forming its own language. The rehabilitation center became her world, a place where she wasn't the woman who had been saved, but the woman who was improving. There, she wasn't defined by what she needed. She was defined by what she could do. The doctor had been there since the beginning, methodical, controlled, calm. He explained setbacks without panic, improvements without celebration. He didn't praise sacrifice, he praised effort, and she responded to that. He noticed how her mood lifted after sessions, how she came home quieter, but lighter. She talked about the exercises, the progress markers, the goals. She rarely talked about the pain anymore. And she never talked about the cost. At night, when she slept, he reviewed numbers, interest rates, payment schedules, restructuring options. $2 million wasn't just a number, it was time. Years of it. He started waking up earlier, taking on extra work, selling things that didn't feel essential anymore. He didn't tell her, not because she wouldn't care, because he didn't want her to feel responsible. He told himself that love absorbed weight, that if he carried enough of it, she wouldn't have to. That logic made sense in a crisis. It made less sense as life stabilized. She began talking about the future in ways that felt selective. She wanted to travel. She wanted to move somewhere quieter. She wanted to start fresh. She spoke as if the past had been closed, as if it had no residue. He listened, nodding, trying to imagine how those plans fit around loan agreements and financial realities. They didn't. But he didn't interrupt her. He didn't want to be the one who reminded her of what it had taken to get here. He didn't want to turn her healing into a ledger. So he stayed quiet. Silence, he learned, can be a form of generosity, but it can also be a form of erasure. She spent more time at the center. Sometimes she said sessions ran late. Sometimes she said she stayed to talk. He didn't question it. Why would he? She was rebuilding her body. That process required patience, trust. The doctor's name came up more often now, always professionally. He thinks I'm ahead of schedule. He says the muscle response is better than expected. He told me not to rush. She spoke his words with a familiarity that felt earned, like someone repeating advice that mattered. Once, he picked her up unexpectedly. She hadn't asked him to. He arrived early, waiting near the entrance. Through the glass, he saw her laughing, not softly, openly. The doctor was standing close, explaining something, gesturing casually. Nothing inappropriate, nothing obvious. Just comfort. Ease. The kind that doesn't exist in crisis. The kind that grows after. She saw him and waved, smiling. Introduced him again, even though they'd already met. The doctor shook his hand firmly. Thanked him. For everything, he said. It sounded sincere. It also sounded final. As if the role he had played had already concluded. That night, she seemed distant. Not cold, just elsewhere. When he asked how therapy went, she gave shorter answers. When he talked about work, she listened politely, without engagement. She fell asleep quickly. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, he wondered whether recovery had an expiration date, whether the moment she no longer needed saving was the moment everything else would have to justify its place. The debt did not care about recovery. It remained, unimpressed. Every payment reminded him that while her body had moved forward, his life had paused. He began to feel something unfamiliar, resentment. He buried it under logic, under morality, under the belief that love didn't keep score. But love also didn't sign contracts alone. She started walking without assistance everywhere now. Her stride was confident, strong. People who didn't know her history would never guess how close she had come to never standing again. She liked that. She liked being seen as whole, complete. He was proud of her. But pride can coexist with loss. She began to talk about independence, about needing to find herself again, about not wanting to be defined by what someone else had done for her. He told her he understood, and he meant it. What he didn't say was that he was still being defined by it. Every choice he made now was shaped by a decision he had made when she couldn't walk. He had tied his future to a moment she no longer lived in. The imbalance grew quietly. She stopped asking his opinion on small things, started making plans without checking first. Not maliciously, naturally, like someone who had regained agency. He noticed how rarely she thanked him now, not because she was ungrateful, because gratitude had become uncomfortable. It implied debt. And she was done with that phase of her life. One evening, he mentioned the loans, casually, not accusing, just factual. She listened, nodded, and said, "We'll figure it out." We. The word landed oddly. She didn't ask how. She didn't ask when. She didn't ask what that meant. She changed the subject. Later that night, he checked his phone and saw a message from the bank. Routine. Expected. But the weight of it pressed down harder than usual. He realized then that the crisis hadn't ended. It had just changed location. The accident had been visible. The recovery had been public. The debt was invisible. And invisibility has a way of isolating the person carrying it. He started noticing things he hadn't before. How she dressed differently for appointments. How she lingered longer before leaving. How she came home energized from places he associated with exhaustion. The doctor's name stopped sounding clinical. It sounded familiar, comforting. He told himself not to overthink it, that jealousy was insecurity, that insecurity was unfair. But doubt doesn't need proof to exist, it only needs pattern. And patterns were forming, slowly, silently. He didn't know it yet, but the hardest part of the story had already begun, not the betrayal, The realization that saving someone can cost more than you ever planned to give. And that sometimes the person you save walks away lighter, while you stay exactly where the impact happened. He didn't discover the betrayal the way people imagine betrayal happens. There was no dramatic confession, no confrontation, no moment where everything shattered at once. Instead, it arrived quietly, like most things that matter. She started coming home later than usual. Not suspiciously late, just late enough to feel different. When he asked, she said therapy sessions had been extended, new evaluations, additional follow-ups. It all sounded reasonable. He had learned long ago not to question medical necessity. That trust had been essential when she couldn't walk. It had become a habit. One afternoon, he went to the rehabilitation center without telling her. Not to spy, to surprise her. He brought coffee. Something small. A gesture from the version of him that still believed those gestures mattered. He arrived just as a session ended. He saw her before she saw him. She was standing in the hallway, weight evenly distributed, posture confident. The doctor was beside her. They weren't touching. They didn't need to. They stood close enough that space had already been negotiated. She laughed at something he said, not politely, not reflexively, with ease. The kind of laughter that doesn't think about being heard. He watched as the doctor placed a hand lightly on her back, guiding her through a doorway. The gesture was professional. It was also intimate in the way familiarity always is. She didn't pull away. She didn't need to. She was no longer the woman who needed to be supported. She was the woman who had already been rebuilt. When she noticed him, her smile didn't disappear. That was what unsettled him most. She didn't look caught. She looked normal. Introductions were brief. The doctor greeted him by name, asked how he was doing, thanked him again for being so supportive during the recovery. It sounded like closure, like gratitude offered at the end of a chapter. On the drive home, she was quieter than usual. He didn't mention what he had seen. Not yet. He told himself it was nothing. That closeness forms naturally in environments built on trust, that professionals cross emotional lines without meaning to. He had seen it before. He had ignored it before. But that night, he couldn't sleep. Something had shifted, not suspicion. Replacement. He began noticing patterns he had dismissed before. How she no longer asked him to attend appointments. How she spoke about the doctor with respect, not affection, but consistency. His presence at her recovery had slowly become optional. He remembered something the doctor had said months earlier. We want her to rely on herself as soon as possible. At the time, it had sounded like encouragement. Now it sounded like transition. He checked his finances again. The debt remained absolute. Unmoving, the interest accumulated whether or not anyone acknowledged it. The loans didn't care that she could walk now. They didn't care that her life had resumed. They belonged to him. Alone. One evening, she came home distracted. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and turned it face down. Not quickly. Casually. That was new. He didn't ask. He waited. Waiting had become his default position. Days passed, then weeks. The distance grew without argument, without explanation. She spoke about the future again. But now, it sounded singular. Not we, just I. I want to feel alive again. I don't want to be defined by the worst thing that happened to me. I need to move forward. He listened. He always did. What she never said was where he fit into that movement. The discovery came through something small. A billing statement. He was reviewing medical expenses when he noticed an appointment that wasn't covered under the standard schedule, a consultation that had happened outside normal hours. He cross-referenced the date. That had been one of the nights she came home late. He didn't confront her. He didn't accuse. He simply asked, carefully, "Was there an extra session that night?" She hesitated. "Just long enough." "Yes," she said. "We talked. I had some concerns." Concerns. The word felt vague. He nodded. Later that night, he checked her phone while she slept. He hated himself for doing it. He hated that he needed to. The messages weren't explicit. They didn't have to be. They were familiar, comfortable, personal, references to progress, shared jokes, plans to talk again. One message stood out. I'm glad you're not in pain anymore. You deserve a life that doesn't revolve around recovery. He sat there in the dark, phone in his hand, feeling something inside him go quiet. It wasn't anger. It was understanding. The doctor had met her at the end of her pain. He had met her at the beginning. The doctor represented what came after. He represented what it had cost. She came home the next day lighter than she had been in months. He watched her move through the house effortlessly. No hesitation, no support, no memory in her body of what it had been like before. He realized then that healing doesn't always include loyalty. Sometimes it creates distance from the people who witnessed the worst parts. That night, he confronted her. Not with accusation, with honesty. I know, he said. She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. She sat down slowly, carefully. I never planned this, she said. That sentence did more damage than any confession could have, because planning would have implied intent. This implied inevitability. She told him she hadn't cheated when she couldn't walk. That mattered to her. She told him she had needed him then. That mattered too. She told him she hadn't meant to hurt him, and that, more than anything, confirmed what he already knew. She hadn't chosen to betray him. She had chosen to leave him behind. The doctor wasn't the betrayal. The timing was. She waited until she no longer needed saving, until dependence had expired, until she could walk away, literally. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand explanations. He asked one question. Did you ever think about what this would cost me? She looked at him. Really looked. For the first time since the accident. And in her silence, he got his answer. The debt was his, the recovery was hers, and the future belonged to whoever reminded her least of the past. As she packed a bag that night, moving slowly but confidently, he stayed seated. He watched the woman he had saved walk out of his life without assistance. The door closed softly. He didn't follow, because some losses don't require pursuit. They require acceptance. And in that quiet, irreversible moment, he understood the truth that would haunt him longer than the debt ever could. She hadn't left because she was cruel. And he was the proof of what she wanted to forget. The morning after she left, the house felt unfamiliar. Not emptier, sharper. As if silence had stopped being peace and had become evidence. He walked through rooms that still carried the shape of her recovery. The chair she used to grip when she first stood up. The corner of the hallway where she practiced turning without pain. The marks on the wall that no one had repainted because they were never supposed to matter. They mattered now, because they were proof that what had happened was real, and because proof is what you're left with when a story ends without the ending you expected. He didn't call her. He didn't beg. He didn't threaten. Not because he was strong, because he had finally understood the worst part. You can't negotiate with someone who has already moved on in their mind. He went to work as usual. He sat in meetings. He answered questions. He performed the motions of a life that still looked functional from the outside. But every time his phone buzzed, his body responded with a quiet reflex. Not hope, impact, because his nervous system had learned to expect loss. At lunch, he opened his banking app again. The numbers were unchanged. They didn't care about what had happened at home. The debt still existed with perfect clarity. $2 million. Not romantic, not symbolic, not tragic in a poetic way. Just arithmetic. He had structured everything to make it possible. He had sold assets, he had refinanced, he had consolidated payments in a way that would keep him afloat if nothing else collapsed. But something had collapsed. Not the plan. The reason. When he had signed those papers, there had been an invisible promise in his mind. Not spoken, not negotiated, assumed. If I give everything, I will never be left behind. He didn't realize that promise had never been accepted by anyone but him. Weeks passed. She didn't come back. At first, she sent messages that sounded carefully kind. I'm sorry. I never wanted it to happen like this. I need to breathe. Then the messages slowed. Then they stopped. The final contact wasn't emotional. It was administrative, a request to pick up the rest of her things. He stared at the message for a long time before responding. Okay. One word. Clean. It took him 2 hours to gather the items she'd asked for. Not because there were so many, because each one carried a memory. A sweater she wore during therapy. A book she read while learning to stand again. A scarf she had wrapped around her neck the day she walked without assistance for the first time. He folded each item slowly, as if careful handling could preserve what had been lost. When she arrived, she didn't come alone. He saw the car pull up through the window. The doctor stepped out first, tall, calm, unhurried. He opened the passenger door like it was natural, like it was already routine. She got out carefully, not because she couldn't walk, but because she had learned to respect her body again. She looked good. Health does that. It erases crisis from the face. She didn't look ashamed. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like someone who had already rewritten her story. He opened the door before they knocked. He didn't want to watch them wait. She met his eyes for a moment. There was no other way, she said softly. He didn't respond, because that sentence was meaningless. There are always other ways. There are just ways people refuse to choose. The doctor didn't speak much. He nodded once, almost respectfully, and carried the bags as if this was simply the next step. His presence didn't feel like insult. It felt like replacement made physical. She glanced inside the house. Her gaze passed over the hallway, the living room, the kitchen. She saw the traces of her recovery and looked away. She couldn't stay too long around evidence. It threatened the version of herself she was trying to become. Before she left, she said something that almost sounded like an apology. "You did save me," she said. Then she paused, as if searching for the right words. "But I can't live my life owing someone." He stared at her. And for the first time, he understood the cruel elegance of what she was saying. In her mind, leaving him wasn't betrayal. It was freedom. He nodded once. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. She turned and walked away without assistance. The doctor followed. The car doors closed. The engine started. And then they were gone. He stood in the doorway long after the sound disappeared. Not because he expected them to return, because he needed time to accept the new shape of his life. The financial consequences came next, not all at once. Like betrayal, they arrived quietly. A notice from the bank, a change in rate, an adjustment to terms. He had anticipated instability. What he hadn't anticipated was isolation. He had planned for hardship with a partner. He was now managing it alone. He called the bank, negotiated, restructured again. He cut more expenses, he sold more things. He moved into a smaller place. And as he reduced his life, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't paying for the surgery anymore. He was paying for the idea that sacrifice could purchase loyalty. He began hearing the story from other people, friends, colleagues. They said it like it was a lesson, like it was something that happened to men who were too soft, too trusting, too hopeful. They treated him like a cautionary tale. But the truth was, he wasn't naive. He hadn't been blind. He had simply believed that the kind of love you can measure in dollars and pain and time would be undeniable. And that belief had cost him everything. One night, months later, he saw her again by accident. Not in person, online. A photo someone posted from a charity event. She was smiling, standing confidently beside the doctor, her hair styled, her posture effortless. The caption said something about resilience, about overcoming hardship, about new beginnings. He stared at the screen. He felt nothing at first. Then he felt something cold and precise settle into him. He realized that in her new story, he didn't exist. Not as a villain, not as a hero, not at all. He wasn't part of the narrative, because acknowledging him would mean acknowledging the debt, and debt was the one thing she refused to carry. He closed the photo and put his phone down. He sat in silence, thinking about the moment he had signed those papers. He remembered how sure he had been, how righteous, how certain that he was doing what a good man was supposed to do. He remembered her voice in the hospital. "If it's too much, don't do it." He understood now what that sentence really was. It wasn't a request. It was a test, a final filter, a way of finding out what kind of man he was. A man who would sacrifice, a man who would carry, a man who would not walk away. She hadn't forced him. That was the final truth. She hadn't demanded $2 million. She hadn't threatened. She hadn't begged. She had simply presented a situation where his identity would do the rest. And he had stepped forward exactly as expected. In the end, the most painful part wasn't the money. Money could be rebuilt, slowly, painfully. The most painful part was the shape of the lesson. He had saved her body, but in doing so, he had taught her something powerful. That someone would always come when she was broken. That someone would always pay to keep her from falling. And once she could stand again, she could choose a life where she didn't have to look at what it had cost. He turned off the lights that night and stood by the window. The city outside moved the way it always did, indifferent, constant. He whispered the truth to himself, not for drama, but for closure. If he hadn't acted, she might never have walked again. But by acting, he taught her she would never walk alone, not because she loved him, because she understood what he was willing to be.